Okay, everyone, we're back here with our coverage on the U.S. Constitution, or the making of the U.S. Constitution. There in Chapter 2, we had some discussion about Chapter 2 on Monday, looking at the Revolution. And so Revolution turns out to be successful, as we know, of course. And now it's looking at governing. How do we go about creating a government, maintaining a government, separating ourselves from Great Britain and becoming independent? Now trying to figure out what is the best form of government there in this new country, the United States. And is the Articles of Confederation, which was used to get all the colonies to stay together to fight the revolution, to stay united, is it still the best form of government to use in this new country, or does there need to be a change? And if there is going to be a change, are there enough people to support that change, or to be quite suspicious about getting rid of the document that was used during the revolution? And this leads us then to a very important question. I mean, what was the reason for the revolution? What is that revolution about? And I think in many ways, we're still having that discussion today. So let's see what we got there. There we go. That will make it more efficient to look that over. So let's look at that question. What was the revolution about? There were some really good discussions, and I'm sure in the beginning of this class period, I talked to you already about that, so I won't go into a lot of detail in this recording. But just mention once again that really enjoyed the discussions online about the subject of liberty, what it might mean. There were some really good distinctions about individual liberty versus state liberty, government liberty. And so in some ways, we can consider what might the leaders of this revolution, what might they have thought of the term liberty? And so liberty could mean freedom from national government control. But then what liberty would states give to the people living in those states? And so does that necessarily mean that the people living there from an individual perspective are going to enjoy liberty? So just because the state has liberty from the national government, or a country has liberty from another country, it doesn't mean that the individuals, or some of the individuals, or perhaps even most of the individuals living in that country, are going to get to enjoy individual liberty. So we know, or at least we should know, right? In the 1780s, at the time of the making of the U.S. Constitution, that term liberty didn't apply to slaves, really didn't apply to women. They didn't have the right to vote, and they were essentially property when it would come to any divorce proceeding, for example. American Indians, some of them did have the opportunity to negotiate with the national government, but for the most part, they were just part of the property that the government would be taking over, and then extending that property to other individuals that could afford to pay for the property. And then you had men without property. So you could be a white man, and you may still think that you have some freedoms and advantages over other people, but in many states, it still came down to your means to own property. And if you didn't have that, then you had a limited opportunity to have liberty. So what is the revolution about? What is the meaning of the term liberty? And what was that revolution about? What was the U.S. Constitution about? Well, there's a cynical interpretation in your text, and it's perhaps worthwhile for you to, it is certainly worthwhile for you to look over, but it's worthwhile for us to consider if that is the accurate way of looking at the meaning of the revolution and the creation of the Constitution. But Charles Beard, an economic historian, on page 49, he comes up with the conclusion that the whole purpose of the revolution was for those that have economic power, and also the creation of the U.S. Constitution. Those who have economic power, it's written this way. The goals of the activities are to make sure that their economic wealth is protected. That's the basis of it. Is that too cynical? That's for, I think, each one of you is from an individual perspective to consider. But read about that on page 49. And again, brings us back to this idea, what's the revolution about? What's the creation of the U.S. Constitution about? So again, to get the states to stay united during this revolution, lots of challenges during the revolution, lots of possibilities for this system to just completely fall apart, to keep everyone on board. You come up with a system of government that everyone can find some benefits to support. And that's called the Articles of Confederation. So you can review this on page 46. Be sure and do that. Look that over. We can see some of the features here of the Articles of Confederation. State governments had the power. So if you're always looking at, and this is going to be one of the themes that we'll come back to in many cases throughout this class, that relationship and in some ways that competition between state governments and national governments. And in some ways we're bringing that out when we look at, when we look at chapter 3, but in our own group project that we'll have later on, in which you serve on a city council, you're looking at considering how much independence should a city government have, and should there be cases in which the state may have some authority over those city governments. And the same thing then can be considered to look at the national government and its authority, its possible authority over state governments. But in this case, in the Articles of Confederation, the form of government during the American Revolution and a few years after the Revolution, it was the situation in which each state had that individual power. The national government had an extremely limited amount of power. So some of the ways in which we can get the sense that state governments had more power than the national government. Each state had one vote. So you didn't have a distinction among the states. So that gave a lot of power to the individual state. And all states must agree to amend the Articles of Confederation. So again, just kind of consider what that might mean if you have one state that does not go along with an amendment. That gives us some sense of the power among the states in the Articles of Confederation. Now, here's an interesting concept to consider as you're looking over this chapter. It's one thing to fight a revolution, then it's another issue to govern. And so while this system may have been in place to unite all these states to get them to fight for a common cause, moving beyond that now to govern after the revolution, is this a practical system? Is this the best way to run a government? So that's something for you to consider as you look this over, read over page 46. So can there be too much freedom? Some of you discussed that in our first discussion online, looking at the issue of liberty and what does it mean to individual freedom. Can there be a point where you're, and I like that some of you brought up the term anarchy. Anarchy meaning there's no government, you know, and if that's the case, and it suggests that there's ultimate freedom in that situation, but is there actually so much freedom that there becomes none, that it becomes too difficult for one to manage that independence, to actually truly be free, to be able to just walk down the road? Maybe that's just not happening in that kind of situation, or it's much harder for that to happen. So could there be too much freedom? And that leads us to this question that you'll see when you read in these early pages of chapter 2 to look at what was a major cause that was that created the thoughts in the powerful people at the time, the movers and the shakers, to be able to say, perhaps this Articles of Confederation is not able to create a government that will produce stability and harmony in our country. And so be sure and notice that event. When this recording is over, we can go into more detail about that. If someone would want to go ahead and share that, that's fine too. We'll go ahead and pause and see if there's anyone that would like to share what they've read in the text and look at that particular event that helped to either change the Articles of Confederation or eventually in the discussion about the new U.S. Constitution, the conclusion that was reached, again, among enough people that were there to say, let's just create a new document, a new governing document. So you have then a key point of the meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 would be representation. How should the states be represented? How should people be counted? And how do you then determine power based on that representation? So you had a large state plan, the Virginia plan, that was the largest state at the time in this new country. You can read about that on page 50. Then you had a small state plan represented by New Jersey, also on page 50. So it would really break down to this: should states get representation based on their population, which would clearly mean that some states would be more represented than others, or should there be equal representation, which would balance out the representation, but would certainly then give more power back to the smaller states? And that was the argument made by the New Jersey plan. So share your thoughts on chat about this. I mean, what might it mean if every state counted the same regardless of population? So I would imagine many of you have some thoughts there. And if you don't want to share that on chat, I hope some of you will want to. But if some of you don't want to do that, then at least maybe put some thoughts together on your notes. So what might it mean if every state counted the same regardless of population? So you got one state that's 10 times bigger than the other state, but when it comes to representation, they count the same. So, and when we mean 10 times bigger, we mean 10 times more population. All right, this will be paused and you can just come up with some of your ideas there. Well, we do see something like that currently, but it's only, of course, in one of the governing bodies in the U.S. Congress, and that would be the U.S. Senate. So half the Senate, 50 senators representing 25 states, half the states, they only represent 10% of the overall population. So in the Senate, what that clearly means is that there are some people that just kind of break it down there in terms of the representation, that some people are overrepresented and some people are underrepresented. And that may mean then that some states have considerable power comparable to their overall population. We're probably not too surprised by this, and this is a specially designed map. That's what a cartogram would be. And we can see here that if you change the shape of states to reflect their overall population, comparable to other states, that we can see some states are going to be much bigger than other states. And there you can see California, Florida, New York, Texas, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, Michigan are states that overall are bigger than their overall land size. And so they're reflected in a different way there. And some states are much smaller, even despite their land size. You can see a dot up there for Alaska, for example. So what that might mean then, if you don't have a way of balancing out the representation, and clearly some states would have more power than others, but should they in some ways have more power if they have more people? And so you'll see also on page 50, the Great Compromise, known as the Connecticut Compromise. And so this is part of that balance. So you would have the representation to be equal in the New Jersey plan, reflected of the New Jersey plan in the US Senate. And so again, some states are going to be overrepresented and some states are going to be underrepresented. And a fair reflection based on population would be in the House of Representatives, the Virginia plan. So to get something passed would be to have both of these bodies in Congress supported, the bicameral legislation, as it's called. And that can be difficult for that to happen, right? And it can then mean through the Senate that some small states can have tremendous power. All right, we'll stop there looking at some of the makings of the U.S. Constitution. And the next time that we're together, we'll go into more detail considering the features of the U.S. Constitution.